Good day. First of all, apologies for the bad picture quality and rather dreadful sound quality today. But as I've said previously, I'm traveling and this is the best I can do. And I'm going to try and give a brief update on what the situation is as I can see it. And it seems to me that there's been two important pieces of news. Firstly, we've now had further confirmation from Ukrainian sources that there was no military advance by Ukraine in Severodonetsk 2 days ago. The claims that we saw appearing in the Ukrainian media, originating from the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk region, and which were repeated by the Western media about Ukrainian advances in Severodonetsk, were untrue. Now, I can say that now with absolute confidence because it's been confirmed by Ukrainian sources, which I consider reliable and which, may I stress, are pro-Ukrainian. They are anti-Russian. They are opposed to what they see as the Russian aggression against their country, and they are all saying that there has been no Ukrainian advances in Severodonetsk. Now, the reason that we had those reports, it's now established, is because no less a person than President Zelensky himself traveled to Lugansk region at around the time when those claims were being made. His official purpose was to meet the troops there, or at least to meet the commanders of the troops. He apparently visited the town of Bakhmut, which is the main Ukrainian base area in this part of northern Donbass, from whence the supplies to the Ukrainian army in Lysychansk and Severodonetsk are funneled from, as they struggle through these very complicated road conditions that lead up to Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. And apparently, in conjunction with Zelensky's trip to Bakhmut, he had meetings with the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk region, who's a man called Gaidar, and a decision was made that the officials would then claim that at the time of Zelensky's visit, the Ukrainian soldiers were putting up some tremendous fight and had managed to push back the Russians in Severodonetsk. So I'm afraid it was not a real victory. It was what you might call a pretend victory, a media victory, the kind of thing that Ukrainian government sometimes does in order to maintain morale in an area where things are not going well for Ukraine. And whilst one can understand that up to a certain point, some Ukrainian commentators are saying that publishing this kind of misleading information is in fact ultimately dangerous, because it doesn't just deceive Ukrainian society, it also ultimately deceives Ukrainian troops on the ground, and that can have bad consequences if they start to feel that their commanders are lying to them, a view with which, by the way, I agree, and which I would have thought perfectly obvious. So anyway, that counter-offensive didn't happen. What has happened is that the Ukrainians are digging in the Azot chemical works on the outskirts of Severodonetsk, and they're fighting bitterly to preserve their positions in Severodonetsk itself. Reports that they were going to pull all their troops out of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk to try and preserve them, and reports that they were going to evacuate Severodonetsk and retreat to Lysychansk, which is more defendable, both of which would have been rational military decisions, at least so far as I can see. Those reports have been contradicted by Ukrainian decisions. In fact, I'm going to make a guess that one of the primary reasons why Zelensky went to Lugansk was to make sure that his instructions and those of the political leadership in Kiev, that every inch of Ukrainian territory in Donbass be fought for and defended, however great the cost and however high the odds, that those instructions were complied with. Now, I've made my own views known, clear, that I don't understand the rationale for these decisions. I accept that they have a political basis and that perhaps they're becoming stronger because the Ukrainians may be sensing that political support for them in the United States and in Europe is waning, so they don't want to be seen to be giving up the war. But having said that, I still think this is a disastrous waste of lives of brave men, but it is the decision that the Ukrainian political leadership has made, and as we see, they've had to resort to these propaganda tactics of claiming advances in Severodonetsk, which haven't happened, in order to try to keep their soldiers, no doubt, complying with these orders and continuing to fight in the way that they are. So that's where we are in Severodonetsk. Now, the way that the situation that leaves is that Severodonetsk itself is largely under Russian control. The Ukrainians are clinging on to the Azot chemical works and a few residential districts just neighboring to it. Lysychansk remains under Ukrainian control, but the roads leading into Lysychansk are being shelled by Russian artillery, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to supply their forces there on a regular basis. And elsewhere in Donbass, the Russians incrementally continue their advances, tightening their grip on more and more places as they move slowly, but certainly towards tightening their grip around this Ukrainian grouping in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And they're also gradually edging closer, ever closer, to the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. It's not dramatic, it's not a case of sweeping advances, but it is a case of incremental advances backed by massive artillery preparation, and it doesn't seem as if the Ukrainians ultimately have any response to this. And as we've discussed in previous programs, the dribs and drabs of Western weapons that get sent to Ukraine are hardly sufficient to turn this thing round. So that's the situation as far as I can see it from a military point of view. But the main subject of my program today is going to be a video, a interview that Russian President Putin gave to Russia television, in which he discussed the food crisis, and he wanted to go out of his way to say that as far as he's concerned, the food crisis is not his responsibility and not Russia's responsibility. Now, he says that, he makes some very interesting general observations about the general economic situation in the world, about the food situation in around the world, and about the energy crisis. And as one might expect, he's putting the blame entirely for everything that's going wrong on Western leaders. And having said that, I do think he makes some interesting points, and as it's very difficult to now reach or read interviews that Putin gives, I'm going to actually read out what I consider to be the relevant extracts. So this is what Putin says about the general food situation and how it's come about, and about the economic situation as well. And from this point on, I'm going to be quoting his exact words. He says, and this is starting with the global food market, he says the following. First, the situation with the global food market did not become worse yesterday, or even with the launch of Russia's special military operation in Donbass in Ukraine. The situation took a downturn in February 2020 during the efforts to counter the pandemic, when the global economy was down and had to be revived. The financial and economic authorities in the United States found nothing better than to allocate large amounts of money to support the population and certain businesses and economic sectors. We generally in Russia did almost the same thing, but I assure you that we were much more accurate and the results are obvious. We did this selectively and got the desired results without affecting macroeconomic indicators, including excessive inflation growth. The situation was quite different in the United States. The money supply in the United States grew by $5.9 trillion in less than 2 years, from February 2020 to the end of 2021. Unprecedented productivity of the money printing machines. The total cash supply grew by 38.6%. Apparently, the financial authorities believe the dollar was a global reserve currency and it would spread as usual, as it did in previous years, would dissolve in the global economy, and the United States would not even feel it. But that did not happen, not this time. As a matter of fact, decent people, and there are such people in the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury recently said they made a mistake. So it was a mistake made by the United States financial and economic authorities. It has nothing to do with us or with our actions in Ukraine. It is totally unrelated. And that was the first step, and a big one, towards the current unfavorable food market situation. Because in the first place, food prices immediately went up. They grew. This is the first reason. The second reason was European countries' short-sighted policies, and above all, the European Commission's policy in regard to energy. We see what is going on there. Personally, I believe that many political players in the United States and Europe have been taking advantage of people's natural concerns about the climate change, and they began to promote this green agenda, including in the energy sector. It seems fine, except for the unqualified and groundless recommendations about what needs to be done in the energy sector. The capabilities of alternative types of energy are overestimated. Solar, wind, any other types, hydrogen power. There are good prospects for the future, probably, but not today. They cannot be produced in the required amount, with required quality and acceptable prices. And at the same time, they began to belittle the importance of conventional types of energy, including and above all hydrocarbons. What was the result of this? Banks stopped issuing loans because they were under pressure. Insurance companies stopped insuring deals. Local authorities stopped allocating plots of land for expanding production and reduced the construction of special transport, including pipelines. All this led to a shortage of investment in the world energy sector and price hikes as a result. The wind was not as strong as expected during the past year. Winter dragged on and prices instantly soared. On top of that, the Europeans did not listen to our persistent requests to preserve long-term contracts for the delivery of natural gas to European countries. They started to wind them down. Many are still valid, but they started winding them down. This had a negative effect on the European energy market. The prices went up. Russia has absolutely nothing to do with this. But as soon as gas prices started going up, fertilizer prices followed suit because gas is used to produce some of these fertilizers. Everything is interconnected. As soon as fertilizer prices started growing, many businesses, including those in European countries, became unprofitable and started shutting down altogether. The amount of fertilizer in the world market took a dive and prices soared dramatically, much to the surprise of many European politicians. However, we warned them about this, and this is not linked to Russia's military operation in Donbass in any way. This has nothing to do with it. But when we launched our operation, our so-called European and American partners started taking steps that aggravated the situation in both the food and fertilizer production. But Russia accounts for 25% of world fertilizer market, As for potash fertilizers, Alexander Lukashenko told me this, but we should double check it, of course, although I think it is true. When it comes to potash fertilizers, Russia and Belarus account for 45% of the world market. The crop yield depends on the quality of fertilizer put into the soil. As soon as it became clear that our fertilizers would not be in the world market, prices instantly soared on both fertilizers and food products, because if there are no fertilizers, it is impossible to produce the required amount of food. One thing leads to another, and Russia has nothing to do with this. Our partners made a host of mistakes themselves, and now they're looking for someone to blame. Of course, Russia is the most suitable candidate in this request. And then he goes into a discussion about Ukraine and whether it's actually true that unblocking Ukrainian food exports is going to change the food situation. And Putin has this to say, and on his figures about Ukrainian food output, I think he's right. And he says the following: there are some objective things. The world produces about 800 million tons of grain, wheat per year. Now we are told that Ukraine is ready to export 20 million tons. So 20 million tons out of 800 million tons amounts to 2.5% of the total. If we proceed from the fact that wheat accounts for merely 20% of all food products in the world, and this is the case, this is not our data, it comes from the United Nations, this means that these 20 million tons of Ukrainian wheat are just 0.5% of total food production, practically nothing. Secondly, 20 million tons of Ukrainian wheat are potential exports. Today, the United States official bodies say that Ukraine's actual probable exports could amount to 6 million tons of wheat. According to our Ministry of Agriculture, the figure is not 6 million, but about 5 million tons. But okay, let us assume it is 6 million, plus it could export 7 million tons of maize. This is the figure of our Ministry of Agriculture. We realize this is not much. In the current agricultural year of 2021-2022, Russia will export 37 million tons of wheat, and I believe we will raise these exports to 15 million tons of wheat in 2022-2023. But this is apropos, by the way. As for shipping out Ukrainian grain, we are not preventing this. There are several ways to export grain. First, you can ship it out via Ukrainian-controlled ports, primarily Odessa and nearby ports. We did not mind the approaches to these ports. Ukraine did. I have already said to all our colleagues many times, let us demine the ports and let the vessels loaded with grain leave. We will guarantee their peaceful passage to international waters without any problems. There are no problems at all. Go ahead. That means the Ukrainians must clear the mines and raise the ships they sunk on purpose in the Black Sea to make it difficult to enter the ports to the south of Ukraine. We are ready to do this, and we will not use the demining process to initiate an attack from the sea. I have already said this. This is the first point. The second point, there is another opportunity. The ports in the Sea of Azov, Berdyansk and Mariupol are under our control, and we are ready to ensure a problem-free exit from these ports, including for exported Ukrainian grain. Go ahead, please. We are already working on the demining process. We are completing this work. At one time, Ukrainian troops laid 3 layers of mines. This process is coming to an end. We will create the necessary logistics. This is not a problem. We will do this. This is the second point. The third, it is possible to move grain from Ukraine via the Danube and through Romania. Fourth, it is also possible through Hungary. And fifth, It is also possible to do this via Poland. Yes, there are some technical problems because the tracks are of different gauges and the wheel bogies must be changed. But this only takes a few hours. That is all. Finally, the easiest way is to transport grain via Belarus. This is the easiest and cheapest way because from there it can be instantly shipped to the Baltic ports and further on to any place in the world. But they would not have to lift sanctions from Belarus. This is not our problem, but they would have to lift sanctions from Belarus. This is not our problem, though. At any rate, President Lukashenko put it like this: if someone wants to resolve the problem of exporting Ukrainian grain, if this problem exists at all, please use the simplest way, through Belarus. No one will stop you. So this problem of shipping grain out of Ukraine does not really exist. Well, that's Putin's comments. You can agree with it or you cannot, but he does what he always does. He comes up with a mass of figures, of data. He's always got his facts at his fingertips. And if you want to disagree with him, it seems to me that you can at least respond to the points he's making. Now, I think on the actual overall state of food supply, I think he's probably right. I think the importance of Ukrainian grain exports has been overstated, and I suspect the conflict itself has been overstated. Of course, he makes some very harsh points about the EU's energy policies and about its green agenda. Well, of course, there are people who are entitled to disagree. They can respond again to the points that Putin is making. But I think that on both the issue of unconstrained money emission in the United States, which, by the way, long precedes the pandemic crisis in February 2020. It goes all the way back to the financial crisis of 2008, and some would say before. Well, in relation to money emission, I think many people, including many market players and economists, would agree and would say that that was responsible for the worldwide inflation. And I would personally add that the reckless overspending of the Biden administration last year has also played a significant role, though curiously, Putin himself doesn't refer to that. And as for the green agenda and the New Deal, well, I know this is a hot topic for many people. Many will strenuously disagree here with what Putin says, but then again, he's hardly alone in his opinions. As for the question of exporting grain from Ukrainian ports, I have to say that what he says seems to me perfectly logical. If they won't export this Ukrainian grain through Odessa, perhaps Putin is being a little disingenuous there in saying that this is entirely and exclusively the fault of the Ukrainians planting mines in Odessa. But, you know, they do have other options. They can export them through the Russian-controlled ports in the Sea of Azov, or they could export them through Belarus. I have to say that the alternative option of shipping grain through Hungary and Romania, which is already taking place, it seems to me, perhaps isn't fulfilling the expectations of some people, but that may be linked more to the realities, to the fact that there is a general shortage of food globally, perhaps because of the fertilizer shortage that Putin is talking about. Anyway, if people want to respond to Putin, if they want to disagree with what he's saying, they're welcome to do so. They can certainly do so. But I think that simply ignoring these comments, as the Western governments and Western media do, that really doesn't help. It doesn't explain the problem, because we could find ourselves perfectly easily, in that case, in a situation where the Ukrainian ports are unblocked, Ukrainian food is exported, and food prices continue to rise, and food shortages around the world continue to grow. And that leads me to my very last point. I can't help but think that what is really happening is not that Putin and the Russians are, in the end, ultimately responsible for this worldwide food shortage. I think, as Putin says, they're being used instead as a convenient scapegoat for a food crisis which has been caused by the kind of policies the West has pursued: money emission, green agendas, sanctions, cutting back on long-term contracts for Russian gas, all of those things, which of course Western leaders don't want to talk about because they don't want to admit to their own responsibility for what has happened. Well, as I said, that's my program for today. Shorter than usual, I believe. And again, I apologize for the poor picture quality, but as I said, I am traveling. I hope you've got some information anyway, useful information from this video. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Remember, you can pick us up on Rumble and Locals. You can support us on Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the great things there. And if, despite the picture quality, you've liked this video, remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me.